Thank you for coming to my presentation on the effect of therapy dogs on stress levels in college preparatory students. A survey conducted by the American Psychological Association found that 45% of teens said they were stressed by school pressures. Academic pressures can affect a student and the amount of stress they feel immensely. Sources of stress for students can include studying for exams, having too much to do, and feeling like there is too much to learn. Stress has also been shown to be even more prevalent in schools with a rigorous curriculum, such as here at Iolani, where many students I know personally are often stressed by a number of factors such as exams, homework, presentations, and more. One study found that self-reports of stress of higher education students were correlated with lower quality of life and well-being. Stress can have both physical and mental effects on students. Some physical effects as a result of stress can include headaches, weight loss, or body aches. Major systems in the body can also be affected and compromised by stress, including the cardiovascular system as a result of increased heart rate and blood pressure, and the endocrine system, which regulates mood, growth and development, tissue function, metabolism, and reproductive functions. There can also be negative mental effects as a result of stress. Mental effects can include depression, feelings of helplessness or anxiety, including other serious mental health problems. Hyperarousal, also caused by stress, can lead to difficulty falling asleep, which can impact a student's ability to concentrate, learn, or remember things. Recent studies have demonstrated the positive effects of therapy dogs on mental health. One study tested the buffer effect of the presence of a close human friend and a therapy dog on stress levels in university students during a standard stress test. They found that a therapy dog's presence was more efficient than a human friend in buffering levels of the stress hormone, cortisol, during the stress test. Another study recorded heart rate and blood pressure in older adults before and after interaction with a therapy dog, and found that therapy dogs were able to reduce both. Given the high levels of stress and the calming effect of therapy dogs, the purpose of my research was to investigate the effectiveness of time spent with a therapy dog on reducing stress levels of students who are enrolled in a school with a rigorous curriculum. For my project, I conducted 2 experiments. The first of the 2 acted as more of a pilot experiment on which I improved and revised for my second experiment. I divided my participants into an experimental group A and a control group B for both experiments. There were 13 participants in group A and 13 in group B for experiment 1. For experiment 1, my 5-step procedure included a baseline stress measure, a stress-inducing test, post-stress test measure, an intervention with either the therapy dog or social media, and a final stress measure. The stress measures I used for this experiment were heart rate as measured by a pulse oximeter and the state trait anxiety inventory, a survey used to measure perceived state stress. I predicted a greater decrease in heart rate and state stress levels for the therapy dog group. For the stress-inducing test, students did the short sing-a-song stress test, which asked students to sing aloud for a video that would later be reviewed. Experimental Group A had a 15-minute intervention with a therapy dog from Canine Therapeutes of Hawaii, and the control group B had a 15-minute intervention with any social media platform of their choosing. In Experiment 2, there were 31 participants in Therapy Dog Group A and 30 for Control Group B. In contrast to Experiment 1, for Experiment 2, participants rested silently for 5 minutes and took an initial demographic survey before beginning the experiment. The 5-step procedure for this experiment included a baseline stress measure, an intervention with a therapy dog or silent rest, a post-intervention stress measure, a stress-inducing test, and a final stress measure. Experiment 2 was similar to Experiment 1, but different in a number of ways. As previously mentioned, students were given 5 minutes of silent rest and an initial survey before beginning the experiment. The social media intervention was also changed to silent rest for the control group. Intervention with the therapy dog or silent rest was also changed to 10 minutes rather than 15. Additionally, the intervention for both groups took place immediately after baseline measures, rather than with the stress-inducing test to follow, in contrast to Experiment 1. The state trait anxiety inventory was also replaced with the positive and negative affect schedule, which measures a person's association with positive and negative feelings. Lastly, the short sing-a-song stress test was replaced with the Stroop test, a more cognitively stressful test. I analyzed my data with JUMP, a statistical analysis software, and results were considered significant at p less than 0.05. Baseline measures of state stress levels, positive affect, negative affect, and heart rate were controlled for in an analysis of covariance, or ANCOVA. All measures were also converted into change scores by subtracting the mean baseline measures from mean post-stress measures. These figures represent the results from the first experiment. The red represents experimental group A, which spent time with the therapy dogs, and the blue represents control group B, which spent time on social media. State stress levels were expected to decrease more after interaction with the therapy dog, which was observed in the data. The therapy dog group's state anxiety levels had a greater decrease as predicted. However, the difference was not statistically significant. The heart rates for both groups were expected to decrease after intervention, and the therapy dog group was expected to decrease more. However, both groups' averages increased after time with the therapy dog, with no significant differences between the groups. In Experiment 2, I was able to address some of the limitations in Experiment 1 in order to yield more confidence in my results. These figures represent data from Experiment 2. In these figures, the red represents experimental group A, which spent time with the therapy dogs, and the blue represents control group B, which had 10 minutes of silent rest. I expected there to be a smaller decrease for the therapy dog group in positive affect, which was measured as association with positive feelings. This prediction was reflected in the data as there was a smaller decrease for the therapy dog group. However, this data was also not significant. There was, on the other hand, a significant difference in negative affect change when controlling for baseline and perceived stress scale, meaning participants associated less with negative feelings after time with the therapy dog. Heart rate was not significant, but there was a trend for the therapy dog group to have a smaller increase than the group that just rested silently, as predicted by the hypothesis. The greater decrease in stress levels based on the state trait anxiety inventory in the therapy dog group from Experiment 1 supports past studies' conclusions that therapy dogs can be effective in lowering stress levels. After I conducted Experiment 1, I realized there were limitations to the procedure, which I attempted to remedy in Experiment 2. In Experiment 1, I found the stress test was not stressful enough, and there were issues with the experimental setup, which may have affected heart rate. Students may have come in feeling nervous, and they interacted with the therapy dogs in a crowded environment, which could have affected their heart rate measures. I also found that the sample size was not large enough. Because of these issues, for Experiment 2, I changed the stress test to the Stroop test, which I piloted with a small group of students to ensure it was stressful enough. I also allowed students a 5-minute rest period before beginning the experiment and moved the therapy dog interaction to a quiet classroom to reduce variance in heart rate measures. I was also able to gather more than double the students from Experiment 1 for the second experiment. These changes led to more confidence in my results that therapy dogs reduce stress. The significant difference between the changes in negative affect in the therapy dog group and the control group in Experiment 2 are in accordance with the hypothesis of therapy dogs as an effective stress buffer. Though not significant, the therapy dog group's association with positive feelings decreased less and heart rate increased less, which also supports the hypothesis. I found a significant difference between the negative affect changes of the therapy dog group and the control group, which supports my hypothesis of the benefits of therapy dogs. Despite some of my results not being significant, there were many trends such as the greater decrease in perceived stress levels and the smaller decrease in positive affect that also support my hypothesis. This research is important because past studies have mostly tested on college or university students, and expanding on and supporting similar studies can promote the use of therapy dogs and bettering mental health in a number of settings, such as high schools with a rigorous curriculum like Iolani. My hope is that this research will encourage the implementation of therapy dogs on this campus as well as others to help stress levels of students. The most important thing I learned from my project and this experience was to never give up. The results from my first experiment were not very clear despite the time and effort I put into gathering the participants and therapy dogs and designing and conducting my experiment. I knew what I needed to fix if I decided to run my experiment again. However, it would take a lot of work and planning to conduct a second one, and it would put me behind in my preparation for the science fair. Despite this, I decided to run my experiment again, and it paid off. I was able to gather significant results in my second experiment and a stronger support of my hypothesis. I highly encourage students who plan on taking Honors Independent in the future to find a topic that they are passionate about, because without that passion, it will be difficult to remain motivated when you run into problems like these. I'd like to thank everyone who helped me to conduct my research and supported me along the way. Thank you to my teacher, Dr. Chan, and my mentor, Dr. Sherry Takushi Sara, for helping me design and conduct my research. I'd also like to thank Mr. Morehouse and Mrs. Lallier for allowing me to use the chapel and chapel classroom to conduct my experiments. Another thank you to Miss Al for offering my experiment to her AP Psychology students as extra credit to help me gather participants for both of my experiments. Another thank you to Mr. Wong, Mr. Tong, and Mrs. Kobayashi for supervising my experiment. I'd also like to thank Miss Brenda Nomura, Mrs. Feiji Chaku, and all of the volunteers and therapy dogs from Canine Therapists of Hawaii for coming to Iolani to help conduct my experiment. Lastly, I'd like to thank my family and friends for their support throughout this project. Thank you.